Chairman.
I call the honourable member Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on the government's mixed ownership model bill. We'll be talking specifically about some of the amendments that the Green Party will be moving to this part. But here I want to talk more generally about the essence of the clauses here, which is to fundamentally change the ownership structure to remove these companies from being state-owned enterprises to essentially being mixed ownership model built as the government's calling them. Now, the first thing I think to say about this is that what the effect will be of taking these companies out from SOEs will be to permanently remove the ability of the New Zealand government to make the New Zealand electricity sector more competitive. And I think that has been a miss point in this whole debate, because by removing these companies from the SOE Act so that they're no longer under the control of the government, they will remove the ability which they have recently exercised to force these companies to transfer assets around within the system. So because they were SOEs, the government was able to force Meridian and Genesis to move generating assets around in order to meet their idea of what a competitive electricity market would look like. Now, whatever you might think about that, and I'm not convinced that they necessarily did the right thing, but by doing this and moving these assets out of the SOE Act, as they do in the clauses in Part 1, they permanently remove the ability of future governments to alter these ownership structures, because once the government is a 51% owner of these companies, it simply cannot direct them to sell some of their generating assets to other companies or sell others of them to buy generating assets from other companies. It is simply not possible, because the minority owners in these companies have rights, and the directors of these companies are required to consider the best interests of the company as a whole. Now, it would be, once these clauses go through in Part 1, it could well be in the best interests of the company to drive up monopoly prices. In fact, that's how you maximise profit and the return to shareholders, is to drive up monopoly prices. And if they were to do that, they would be acting in the best interests of the company once these clauses had gone through, which move the companies out from the SOE Act. So, in fact, what the government is doing is locking into place the current setup in terms of generating assets within the electricity market by going through with this. Now, if in future we were to discover that in fact the arrangement that we had in terms of the electricity generating assets wasn't the most competitive arrangement for the electricity market, we would no longer have that ability. And what we know about the electricity market is that it is deeply uncompetitive. The Commerce Commission, in its report in 2009, came to the view that the electricity sector was essentially ripping off the rest of the economy because the way that the market has been established in this sector is deeply uncompetitive. And it's not at all surprising. We have a small number of generators, retailers who dominate the market and who have the ability to maximise the price and returns that they get. So by the government transferring these assets away from being state-owned enterprises and the ability of the government to put some pressure on them, what we are guaranteeing is that these companies can freely pursue their right to charge monopoly rents and monopoly prices. That's what it means. So when we did the analysis and went through it all the different lines, companies, areas, and compared the prices that SOEs charge versus the prices that private companies pay, what we found was that basically that the private companies are charging around 12–13% more than the SOEs. And when you look at the comments from the CEOs of the private companies, they are very clear that they believe that the state-owned enterprises are undercharging for electricity. So when the CEOs from Trustpower and Contact have been reported on this issue, what they've said is that the SOEs are undercutting them on price. And so by transferring these companies from being in the State-Owned Enterprise Act, which is what this Part 1 does, and putting them simply as regular profit maximisers as regular companies in the market, we remove the anchor that the SOEs currently provide to the electricity market. And so in the context of a market which is fundamentally uncompetitive, because it's a small market with a small number of dominant players, we are removing the anchor that these SOEs currently provide to price, and that's why prices will go up. The other argument which this government has used repeatedly as to why they need to move them out from being SOEs is around access to capital. So the government said, we have to give these companies access to capital, and that's why we have to privatise them or partially privatise them. But this argument, Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Dr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This argument is fundamentally flawed. So think this argument through. So what the government's saying is they need more access to capital. Well, who gets the proceeds from the sale? It isn't the companies, it's the government, right? So then how will these companies, once they're partially privatised, raise more capital? The only way they can do it is to issue more shares. Now, if the government is to maintain its 51% ownership of these companies, then all the new shares issued, half of all the new shares issued have to be purchased by the Crown. 51% of them have to be purchased by the Crown. So half of all the new capital, which will be made available to these companies by issuing new shares, has to actually be provided by the government. Now, is the government actually going to provide half of all the new capital that these companies want? I think it's very unlikely, because the government has gone on at great length about how they're short of capital and about how the way that capital is being allocated is extremely irrational, and they don't want to be caught up in these SOEs and the way they use capital anymore. In which case, what it means is the only option is for the government shareholding to fall under 51%. So all the promises about maintaining 51% ownership will come up against the desire of these companies to gain access to more capital and require the government to provide half of all the new capital, which the government, of course, will not do. The other part about this is the cost of this process, of moving these companies from no longer being SOEs. We asked the Minister of Finance about this today, and basically he's saying that we're talking at an initial cost of somewhere in the order of $120 million to $140 million if they get, say, $7 billion as they're proposing. So $120 million will be paid by taxpayers for the privilege of losing control of these companies. So for the privilege of giving control of these companies from all of us to a tiny minority of us, we're going to have to pay $120 to $140 million. And then on top of that, the government's talking about a loyalty scheme. Now, the way loyalty schemes work is essentially the seller gives away free shares to buyers if the buyers meet certain conditions. In the case of the Queensland rail privatisation done by the Labor government in Queensland, of course with the result they got chucked out at the next election, in that example, what the government did is it gave the 16th share for free to those who'd bought 15 shares and hung on to them for 2 years. That is effectively a 6% cost to the seller. Now, if there is a 6% cost to the seller in this example, in New Zealand, if the government decides to go down the same path, then we're talking about up to $400 million will be foregone as a result of giving away free shares as part of this loyalty program. So when you add that to the $120 million the government has already confirmed it's planning to spend, we are talking about spending somewhere in the order of $500 million of taxpayers' money in order to sell something that taxpayers already own against the wishes of the vast majority of New Zealanders who are resolutely opposed to the privatisation program. How can that possibly be the right thing for this government to do? On top of that, we have the lost earnings going forward. In the Budget Policy Statement 2011, done by Treasury, Budget Policy Statement 2012, they said as a result of the clauses in Part 1, the removal of these companies from being SOEs and partial privatisation, the government is $100 million a year worse off on its operating balance excluding gains and losses. That is basically the budget deficit. So $100 million a year permanently worse off year after year after year after year as a result of the clauses in this bill. So if this goes ahead, it will add to the government debt by $100 million a year, because the government debt is fundamentally the result of the addition of all the deficits that this government runs, and it's a government that runs very, very large deficits. So on top of the fact it's going to have a huge impact in terms of the first round of costs of doing, or maybe $500 million of doing the privatisation program, on top of that the government is worse off by $100 million every year because of the privatisation program, according to Treasury figures in the Budget Policy Statement 2011, repeated again in the Budget Policy Statement 2012. So when the government says this is fiscally responsible, what I suggest people do who are listening to this debate is read the Budget Policy Statement 2011-2012, and you will see that this is the most fiscally that readers will see that this is the most fiscally reckless policy that you could possibly be engaged in terms of its impact on the government's fiscal position. This is really bad policy, and it's driven by the fact that they have to pay for the tax cuts for upper income earners.
I call the honourable member Clayton Cosgrove.